In 1985, the co-founder of Apple Computer was escorted out of his own company's headquarters in Cupertino, California. Steve Jobs, the visionary who'd built Apple from a garage startup into a $2 billion company, had just lost a boardroom coup to a man who'd spent his entire career selling soda. John Sculley, the former Pepsi president, had taken control of Apple and pushed out its founder. Over the next decade, Apple would lose 90% of its market share, burn through 3 CEOs, and come within 90 days of bankruptcy. The company that had revolutionized personal computing was dying, all because Steve Jobs made one catastrophic hiring decision. Today, you'll learn how a single recruitment destroyed billions in value, why mixing sugar water executives with tech visionaries creates disaster, and the 3 warning signs that your company is about to implode from within. This is the story of the most expensive hiring mistake in corporate history. A mistake that would cost shareholders over $100 billion and nearly erase Apple from existence. If you find value in learning about the economic disasters that shaped our modern business world, please hit that like button and subscribe to The Sleeping Economist. We uncover the financial stories you slept through, the ones that explain why your world works the way it does today. Ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation into the hidden economic forces that control your life. Chapter 1. The Perfect Storm That Created a Disaster. This brings us to 1983, when Apple Computer was riding high on a wave of innovation and money. The company had gone public just 3 years earlier at $20 per share, creating more millionaires than any IPO since Ford Motor Company. Their Apple II computer was essentially printing money, selling over 750,000 units and generating $335 million in revenue. But beneath this success, a perfect storm was brewing that would nearly destroy the company. Steve Jobs had a problem that would prove fatal. The board of directors, led by venture capitalist Arthur Rock and former Intel executive Mike Markula, believed Jobs wasn't ready to be CEO. At 28 years old, he was brilliant at product development, but struggled with operations, supply chain management, and the mundane realities of running a growing corporation. He would spend hours debating the curve of a computer case while inventory piled up in warehouses. He would fire entire teams for not meeting his impossibly high standards, then wonder why projects were behind schedule. The board's concerns were backed by hard numbers. Apple's inventory turnover was 3 times slower than IBM's. The company had $150 million tied up in unsold computers. The new Lisa computer, which Jobs had championed, was failing spectacularly, despite costing $50 million to develop and pricing at an astronomical $9,995. Only 10,000 units sold in the first year against projections of $70,000. IBM had just entered the personal computer market with massive resources and decades of corporate relationships. In just 2 years, IBM had captured 26% of the personal computer market, while Apple's share was declining. The board wanted what they called adult supervision, a seasoned executive who could transform Apple from a brilliant but chaotic startup into a disciplined Fortune 500 company. They started a secret CEO search, looking at executives from IBM, Intel, and General Electric. But Jobs had his own idea, and it would prove to be his greatest mistake. Enter John Sculley. As president of Pepsi Cola, he'd engineered the Pepsi Challenge marketing campaign that had taken significant market share from Coca-Cola for the first time in history. He'd increased Pepsi's revenue from $1 billion to $8 billion. He'd launched Diet Pepsi, which became a billion-dollar brand. Wall Street loved him. Fortune magazine had named him one of America's 10 best executives. The board saw him as the perfect choice, someone who understood mass marketing, retail distribution, and running a global organization with 50,000 employees. But Sculley wasn't interested initially. He was making $500,000 a year at Pepsi, worth $1.5 million in today's money, lived in a Connecticut mansion, had a driver, a corporate jet, and was on track to become Pepsi's CEO within 2 years. His wife loved New York society. His children were in private schools. Why would he leave the pinnacle of corporate America for a computer company in California that most executives still considered a fad? This is where Jobs deployed what colleagues called his reality distortion field. He pursued Sculley like a romantic conquest. Over 4 months, Jobs flew to New York 17 times. He would call Sculley at midnight to discuss philosophy. He would send him computers with personalized messages on the screen. He invited Sculley to California, showing him the future Apple campus, introducing him to engineers who spoke about changing humanity through technology. The turning point came during a rooftop walk in Manhattan on March 26, 1983. As they looked over Central Park, Jobs asked Sculley the question that would alter both their destinies. Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world? Sculley later admitted this question knocked the wind out of me. It triggered what he called an identity crisis. Was he just a soft drink salesman, or could he be part of something historic? On April 8, 1983, he agreed to become Apple's CEO with a package worth $2.2 million, including a $1 million signing bonus, $1 million salary, and stock options that would vest over 5 years. It was one of the richest CEO packages in corporate history at the time. The tech press celebrated. The New York Times ran a front-page story. Apple's stock jumped 12% in a single day. Wall Street analysts upgraded the stock, saying Apple now had the professional management to compete with IBM. Everyone believed the company had found its perfect leader. No one suspected they had just witnessed the beginning of Apple's near-death experience. Chapter 2. The honeymoon that masked the coming war. But here's where it gets interesting. The relationship between Jobs and Sculley started like an intense romance. Sculley later described it as love at first sight, and wrote that he'd never met anyone like Jobs. They finished each other's sentences, took long walks discussing Bauhaus design and Zen philosophy, and Sculley even moved to a house just 5 minutes from Jobs. Employees called them the dynamic duo. They ate lunch together every day. They called each other at night to discuss ideas. For the first year, everything seemed perfect. Sculley brought immediate credibility. He hired experienced executives from major corporations. He implemented inventory management systems that reduced waste by 40%. He negotiated better deals with suppliers, improving margins by 8%. He created Apple University to train dealers and salespeople. Revenue grew 55% in his first year. The board was thrilled. But fundamental differences were already emerging. Sculley came from a world where you conducted extensive market research, tested products with focus groups, and made incremental improvements based on consumer feedback. At Pepsi, he'd spent 6 months testing 17 different formulations of Diet Pepsi. He'd run 25,000 taste tests. He believed in data, research, and careful planning. You kept inventory lean, margins high, and shareholders happy. If a new soda flavor tested poorly, you reformulated it or killed it before launch. Jobs operated from the opposite philosophy. He believed consumers didn't know what they wanted until you showed them. He famously said, "It's not the customer's job to know what they want." He would spend millions perfecting tiny details that most users would never notice, like the inside of the computer case that no one would see. He insisted on custom screws that cost 10 times more than standard ones. While Sculley worried about quarterly earnings, Jobs obsessed over font kerning and the sound the keyboard made when you typed. These philosophical differences exploded around the Macintosh launch in 1984. Jobs insisted on pricing it at $2,495, almost $1,000 more than Sculley recommended, based on market research that showed consumers wouldn't pay more than $1,500 for a personal computer. Jobs wanted to spend $15 million on a Super Bowl commercial that didn't even show the product. Sculley thought this was insane. Pepsi would never run an ad that didn't show the product and mention its benefits at least 3 times. The disagreements became personal. Sculley wanted to add more RAM to the Macintosh to make it more functional for business users. Jobs refused, saying it would compromise the design. Sculley suggested creating a Macintosh Junior at a lower price point. Jobs was horrified at the idea of diluting the brand. Sculley proposed adding arrow keys to the keyboard. Jobs screamed that arrow keys were for idiots who didn't understand the mouse was the future. The Macintosh launched with incredible fanfare on January 24, 1984. The 1984 commercial, directed by Ridley Scott, became the most famous ad in Super Bowl history. The media coverage was unprecedented. Initial sales were strong, 70,000 units in the first 100 days. Jobs predicted they would sell 500,000 units in the first year. But then reality hit. Sales collapsed to just 10,000 units per month by September. The Mac was too expensive for consumers, too weak for businesses. It had just 128K of memory when competitors offered 256K. It had no hard drive, requiring users to constantly swap floppy disks. It had almost no software, just MacWrite and MacPaint. You couldn't even connect it to a printer without buying a $500 adapter. The failure was catastrophic. Apple had spent $78 million marketing the Macintosh. They'd built inventory for 80,000 units per month. Warehouses filled with unsold computers. The company had to write off $40 million in excess inventory. Apple's stock fell from $63 to $14. The company reported its first quarterly loss ever. Someone had to take the blame, and a vicious power struggle erupted that would tear Apple apart. Chapter 3. The coup that changed Silicon Valley forever. The breaking point came in early 1985, and the details of what happened next read like a corporate thriller. Apple was burning through $2 million in cash per day. The board demanded immediate action. Layoffs were inevitable. The only question was who would wield the axe. Secret meetings were held in hotel rooms. Executives chose sides. What followed was the most dramatic boardroom coup in Silicon Valley history. Sculley believed Jobs was the fundamental problem. His perfectionism caused endless delays. The Macintosh was 18 months late. His pricing was unrealistic. He refused to lower prices even as inventory piled up. His management style was creating chaos. He would publicly humiliate employees, calling them bozos and shitheads in meetings. 3 of Apple's top engineers had quit, specifically citing Jobs as the reason. But Jobs had a completely different view. He believed Sculley didn't understand technology, was too focused on profits over products, and was turning Apple into just another boring corporation. Sculley had started requiring detailed business plans for new products. He'd implemented formal performance reviews. He'd created organization charts and reporting structures. To Jobs, this was the death of innovation. The conflict intensified through a series of increasingly hostile confrontations. In February 1985, Sculley removed Jobs' ally, Steve Wozniak, from active involvement in product development. In March, he restructured the company to reduce Jobs' influence. By April, the two were barely speaking except in board meetings where they would argue viciously in front of other executives. On April 10, 1985, the board met for a crucial session. Sculley presented a reorganization plan that would remove Jobs as head of the Macintosh division and give him a vague role as global visionary, with no direct reports, no budget, and no operational responsibility. It was essentially a ceremonial position designed to push Jobs out without the bad publicity of firing him. Jobs was furious. He began plotting his own coup, codenamed Project Taurus. He secretly met with 5 key executives: Jean-Louis Gasset, head of Apple France; Del Yocum, COO; Bill Campbell, head of sales; Susan Barnes, CFO; and Jay Elliott, head of HR. His plan was simple but audacious. While Sculley was traveling to China for a week-long trip, Jobs would convince the board to fire Sculley and make Jobs CEO. But Sculley had his own spies. Jean-Louis Gasset, who Jobs thought was an ally, was actually loyal to Sculley. He informed Sculley of the coup attempt just hours before Sculley was supposed to leave for China. Sculley canceled his trip and called an emergency board meeting for May 24, 1985. The showdown was brutal and public. Sculley confronted Jobs in front of the entire executive team in the boardroom at 10:30 a.m. According to witnesses, Sculley's hands were shaking as he accused Jobs of plotting behind his back, of being impossible to work with, of caring more about his ego than Apple's survival. Jobs responded by calling Sculley a failure who was destroying Apple's soul, someone who knew nothing about computers and cared only about spreadsheets. The board then did something unprecedented. They asked every executive to publicly choose sides. One by one, they went around the table. Mike Markkula, who'd been like a father to Jobs and had invested $250,000 of his own money to help start Apple, sided with Sculley. Arthur Rock, the legendary venture capitalist who'd funded Intel and Apple, chose Sculley. Even Steve Wozniak, Jobs' co-founder and childhood friend, refused to support him, saying Jobs had become impossible to work with. The vote was unanimous. Sculley would remain as CEO. Jobs was stripped of all operational duties effective immediately. He could keep his chairman title and his office, but he had no power, no team, no projects, no authority. He was, in his words, in Siberia. For 4 agonizing months, Jobs came to an empty office. Former colleagues avoided him in hallways. His keycard no longer opened most doors. His name was removed from distribution lists. The man who'd co-founded Apple at age 21, who'd built it into a $2 billion company by age 30, was now a ghost in his own creation, wandering the halls like a living reminder of what happens when you challenge corporate authority. Chapter 4. The Systematic Destruction of Innovation. With Jobs gone, Sculley immediately transformed Apple into exactly what he'd promised the board, a traditional consumer products company that operated like Pepsi, but sold computers instead of soft drinks. What followed was a masterclass in how professional management can systematically destroy innovation while temporarily boosting profits. Sculley hired executives from traditional corporations who knew nothing about technology. The new head of engineering came from Black & Decker, a power tools company. The head of marketing came from Procter & Gamble, where he'd sold laundry detergent. The CFO came from Ford Motor Company. These executives brought discipline and process to Apple, implementing the same systems that worked in mature industries selling commodities. He created focus groups to test every product decision, just like Pepsi tested soda flavors. Engineers would present prototypes, and groups of random consumers would vote on features. The problem? Consumers in 1986 didn't know they wanted a graphical user interface, a mouse, or desktop publishing. They wanted cheaper computers that ran the same software as IBM. So that's what Sculley gave them. Apple's product line exploded into incomprehensible chaos. Instead of Jobs' vision of simplicity, Sculley created dozens of confusing variations. The Macintosh LC, Classic, Classic 2, Color Classic, Performa 200, Performa 400, Performa 430, Performa 450, Performa 460, Centris 610, Centris 650, Quadra 700, Quadra 800, Quadra 840 AV. Even Apple's own salespeople couldn't explain the differences between models. Consumers were paralyzed by choice and often bought nothing. Initially, the financial numbers looked spectacular. Revenue grew from $1.9 billion in 1985 to $7.1 billion by 1993. Gross margins increased from 42% to 53%. The stock price tripled. Wall Street analysts praised Sculley's operational excellence. Harvard Business School wrote case studies about his transformation of Apple. He was featured on the cover of Business Week as corporate America's most innovative CEO. But underneath these superficial metrics, Apple was dying a slow death. The company's market share in personal computers fell from 16% when Jobs left to just 3% by 1993. Microsoft Windows, which blatantly copied many Macintosh features, became the standard operating system for 90% of computers worldwide. While Apple charged $3,000 for a computer, competitors sold Windows PCs for $800 with better specifications. The Sculley's signature product and his attempt to prove he could innovate became one of technology's most spectacular failures. Announced in 1992, it was supposed to revolutionize mobile computing. Sculley spent $500 million developing it, more than NASA spent developing the space shuttle's engines. He promised it would recognize handwriting, manage your calendar, and connect wirelessly to networks. The reality was a disaster. The Newton couldn't recognize handwriting properly. It would translate "hello world" as "hell weird." It was too big to fit in a pocket, too small to use as a real computer. The battery lasted just 2 hours. It cost $690 when a powerful desktop computer cost $1,000. Late-night comedians mocked it relentlessly. Gary Trudeau devoted entire Doonesbury comic strips to ridiculing it. The Newton became synonymous with corporate hubris and technological failure. By 1993, Apple was in full crisis mode. The company lost $188 million in Sculley's final quarter. Market share had fallen below 3%. Microsoft was worth 10 times more than Apple. Dell Computer, founded in a dorm room in 1984, was now selling more computers than Apple. Even worse, Apple's best engineers were fleeing to competitors or startups. The company that had invented the personal computer was becoming irrelevant. Chapter 5. The Decade of Chaos and Near Death. The board fired Sculley in June 1993, but the damage was done. What followed was a decade of chaos that brought Apple to within 90 days of bankruptcy. The story of Apple's 3 CEOs between Sculley and Jobs' return is a case study in how once great companies die, not in a sudden collapse, but through a series of increasingly desperate decisions that accelerate the decline. First came Michael Spindler, the German president of Apple Europe, who spoke broken English and had never run a technology company. His strategy was simple: sell Apple to someone else before it died. Over 18 months, he conducted secret negotiations with IBM, Sun Microsystems, Philips Electronics, and even Motorola. Each deal fell apart for the same reason: no one wanted to pay more than $10 per share for a company trading at $28. Spindler's tenure was marked by operational disasters. The PowerBook 5300, Apple's flagship laptop, had batteries that caught fire. Apple had to recall 100,000 units at a cost of $100 million. The Copland operating system, meant to compete with Windows 95, was canceled after spending $250 million and 6 years in development. Apple's server business, which Spindler had promised would generate $500 million in revenue, sold exactly 1,400 units. When Spindler was fired in February 1996, Apple's board made an even worse choice: Gil Amelio, a semiconductor executive who'd never worked in personal computers. Amelio was everything Silicon Valley wasn't. He wore three-piece suits, drove a Mercedes limousine, and insisted employees call him Dr. Amelio because he had a PhD in physics. His first act as CEO was to redecorate his office for $2 million while laying off 3,000 employees. Amelio's 500 days as CEO were catastrophic. Apple's stock fell from $28 to $13. The company lost $1.6 billion, more than it had made in profit during its entire history. Market share dropped to 2.6%. Best Buy and Circuit City stopped selling Macs because returns exceeded sales. CompUSA relegated Apple products to a dusty corner they called the death zone. The numbers were stark. Apple had 90 days of cash left. Suppliers demanded payment in advance. Developers stopped creating Mac software. Adobe, whose Photoshop was crucial to Apple's survival, threatened to discontinue Mac support. Microsoft Office for Mac hadn't been updated in 3 years. Even Apple employees bought Windows computers for their children because Macs couldn't run educational software. Chapter 6: The Resurrection and the Lessons. While Apple was dying, Steve Jobs was building his revenge with surgical precision. He founded Next Computer, creating advanced workstations that were years ahead of anything Apple produced. Though Next never succeeded commercially, selling just 50,000 computers in 7 years, its technology was revolutionary. The operating system was so advanced that Tim Berners-Lee used it to create the World Wide Web. Jobs also bought the computer graphics division of Lucasfilm for $10 million, transforming it into Pixar. While Apple's executives focused on quarterly earnings, Jobs spent 10 years and $50 million of his own money developing computer animation technology. When Toy Story premiered in 1995, it generated $365 million and made Jobs a billionaire, worth more than all of Apple's executives combined. In December 1996, desperate for new technology, Apple acquired Next for $429 million. Jobs returned as an advisor with no official power, but he systematically orchestrated a takeover. He convinced the board that Amelio was incompetent. He leaked negative stories to the press. He recruited former allies still at Apple. By July 1997, the board fired Amelio and begged Jobs to return as CEO. What Jobs found was shocking. Apple had 350 different computer models but couldn't explain why customers should buy any of them. The company had $1.2 billion in unsold inventory, computers that were obsolete before they left the warehouse. Apple was spending $100 million annually on research that produced no products. The company had 15 different teams working on operating systems that didn't work. Jobs' transformation was swift and brutal. He killed the Newton immediately, writing off $100 million. He eliminated 350 products to focus on just 4: a desktop and laptop for professionals, a desktop and laptop for consumers. He fired 3,000 employees in a single day. He shut down factories, outsourced manufacturing, and turned inventory 12 times faster than before. But Jobs didn't just cut. He invested in what mattered. He brought back Jonathan Ive, the designer who'd been marginalized under previous CEOs, and gave him unprecedented power. He invested $150 million in developing OS X, based on Next technology. He created Apple stores when everyone said retail was dead. He spent 3 years developing the iPod when analysts said Apple should stick to computers. The results speak for themselves. The iMac, launched in 1998, became the best-selling computer in America. It came in colors like Bondi blue and tangerine, something Sculley would have considered ridiculous. The iPod, introduced in 2001, revolutionized music and generated $8 billion in revenue. The iPhone, unveiled in 2007, became the most profitable product in corporate history, generating over $200 billion in revenue. The transformation in value is staggering. When Jobs was fired in 1985, Apple was worth $2 billion. When he returned in 1997, it was worth $3 billion, barely more than a decade earlier despite massive inflation. When he died in 2011, Apple was worth $350 billion. Today, it's worth over $3 trillion, making it the most valuable corporation in human history. But here's the crucial insight that most people miss. Sculley wasn't entirely wrong about the future. Many of his ideas, mobile computing, digital assistants, multimedia software, app stores, were visionary. The Newton failed, but it predicted the iPhone. QuickTime pioneered digital video that became iTunes. Sculley's Knowledge Navigator concept from 1987 essentially described the iPad 20 years early. The difference wasn't vision, it was execution. Sculley could see the future but couldn't build it. He understood what was possible but not what was necessary. He focused on features that marketing research said customers wanted, rather than creating products customers didn't know they needed. That required something that can't be taught at Wharton or learned selling sugar water: the ability to create products so compelling that people line up overnight to buy them. Second, watch for the product complexity disease. When Jobs returned to Apple, he reduced 350 products to 4. When companies start creating confusing product lines with minor variations, they're compensating for lack of innovation. Think about successful companies today. Tesla makes 4 car models. Netflix has 3 subscription tiers. Spotify has 2. Amazon Prime has 1 membership level. Now think about failing companies. They typically have dozens of barely differentiated products that confuse customers and cannibalize each other. If you can't explain a company's product line in 1 sentence, management has lost focus. Third, understand the founder's paradox. The very qualities that make founders difficult, obsessiveness, stubbornness, unrealistic standards, inability to compromise, are often what make them irreplaceable. When Microsoft pushed out Bill Gates, innovation stalled for a decade until Satya Nadella rebuilt the company. When Starbucks fired Howard Schultz, the stock fell 50% until they brought him back. When Twitter's founders left, the company drifted aimlessly for years. Professional managers can optimize existing businesses, but only obsessive founders can create new ones. The final lesson is about the nature of innovation itself. Sculley tried to innovate through market research, focus groups, and careful analysis. Jobs innovated through intuition, taste, and obsessive attention to detail. Sculley asked customers what they wanted. Jobs showed them what they didn't know they needed. Sculley managed for quarterly earnings. Jobs built for decades he wouldn't live to see. The difference between selling sugar water and changing the world isn't about intelligence or effort. It's about understanding that true innovation requires believing in something before there's evidence it will work. If stories like this, where we uncover the economic events that shaped our world while most people weren't paying attention, fascinate you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, because we're just getting started with these financial educational mysteries.